introduce our celebrity talk show guest for today. It's Nick Argyres from Washington University in St. Louis, the Olin School, where he serves as the Vernon W. and Marion K. Piper Professor of Strategy. He previously served on the faculties of Boston University and University of Southern California. He earned his PhD at University of California, Berkeley, where he did his dissertation on technology strategy and organization under Oliver Williamson and David Teese. He served as senior editor for Organization Science for over a decade and has served as a special issue co-editor for several other special issues, serves on numerous editorial boards, has served as the division chair of the BPS division for Academy of Management, and also previously, my condolences for this, served as the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty, always a thankless job at the Olin School. Nick is, obviously his research has had quite an impact. He has over 7,000 Google Scholar citations. And his research primarily studies the relationship between firm strategy and the internal organization of the firm, as well as the determinants of organizational boundaries, the structure of contractual relationships between organizations, and the effects of organizational politics on strategic decision-making. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Nick Argyres. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Rich.
So again, thank you for being here. Let me turn off the screen share so I can move that over to the other window. Good. And I like to start these interviews by, observing. I've never yet heard a 10-year-old say to their mother, "Mom, I really want to be a strategy professor when I grow up." I've never heard that. So I am guessing that, in most cases, most of us come to this profession through an indirect path. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that path was for you. How is it that you got interested in this career in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me, it's pretty straightforward. I was a frustrated economist. So I joined an economics program at Berkeley, and my plan was to study economic development. And I was particularly interested in development because from an undergraduate, I studied a lot of economic history and even Marxist thought, and got convinced that institutions were an important reason why economies might grow or not. And yet a lot of economics at the time was focused on markets. The one area in economics that really seemed to pay attention to institutions was development economics. So that's why I chose that field. And I realized when I got to Berkeley that I was surrounded by really smart students from developing countries who knew their own country's institutions much better than I could ever do, or at least I could never really catch up to them. I did have connections to the country of Greece, and so I floated the possibility of doing something about Greece and was told that Greece was a middle-income country, not considered developing at the time. So it wouldn't count as a development economics study. So then I kind of cast around for other areas where institutions are studied. There weren't too many, and I discovered Oliver Williamson's course, and that's how I got connected with him.
Okay, so your PhD then technically is not in BPP, right? It's in economics?
Right. By the time I sort of discovered Williamson, it was sort of too late to switch over to the business school. I thought about it. I was close, but I would have had to do, I think, some more coursework or something. So I just ended up being advised by business school people, even though most of my coursework was in econ.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about how you found your dissertation topic, maybe what path you went on. I know, again, this tends to be an indirect path for some people. You might explore different topics and reject some and then finally settle on one. What was your what was your path to finding this dissertation topic, which was on, technology strategy and organization?
Well, it took me a while, I will say, and I did reject 2 or 3. I think one of them I pursued for months, 3, 4, 5 months, and ended up rejecting it for lack of data, but then actually picking it up later when I was a professor and continuing on it, writing a paper about it. That was university-industry relationship. So I think there's an important lesson there for the doctoral students that keep your rejected projects in mind, or at least written down somewhere, because you might get some data, or might get some inspiration later, can revive them. I think a lot of doctoral students get inspired for dissertation topics based on their business experience. They saw something that they were curious about, or they'd like to get explained, or there were somehow important phenomena. I wasn't like that. I didn't have much business experience, like a pure academic guy. So I'm not sure I'm the model. In my case, it was simply reading a lot of work by Chandler and by Alfred Sloan about the multi-divisional corporation, and then reading my advisor's interpretation of those works and his sort of arguments about the underlying drivers of M-form adoption, and not really being fully satisfied with that treatment, feeling like it's kind of overemphasizing decentralization as the benefit of the M-form. It just didn't seem right to me, but I didn't have a good basis for it. I had no experience in companies. So I said, I think I'd like to explore that more by talking to managers in companies. And so that's how I got onto it, and I think that might be a more general type of thing of just being dissatisfied or not fully believing that someone that's otherwise quite famous and wrote a very important work really got the whole story right.
Right.
And wanting to at least fill it out.
Right. So the dissatisfaction with some weakness or limitation of the existing research.
Yeah, and I want to say more generally, one of the struggles I have with some doctoral students is, not all, but some, too willing to accept authority. And in some sense, research is really about progress. It's about getting beyond what the authorities have told us.
Right.
And that was actually, I've been in a bit of a, tension with my advisor, I think my whole career, but he recently died. But I think that's the idea, is not to be too respectful of authority. And I think that is the instinct for many doctoral students is to simply try to push forward some view that's already widely accepted.
Right. Right.
And that leads to, I think, more incremental kind of progress rather than substantial progress.
Right.
You can be very respectful and still be questioning. And I think it's a cultural thing also. I think in the US, we're, trained to be a little bit more confrontational with our elders, and that's okay. It's considered fine. I think in other cultures, people expect more sort of conformity, and I think that doesn't lead to good research.
So one issue similar to that I find with doctoral students is the challenge. They may have an interest in a particular research topic, but they still have a difficulty narrowing it down to a particular research question. So maybe could you take us through what that experience was like for you in your dissertation? How did you get from your topic to something more narrowly researchable as a research question?
Yeah. I think there are different ways to come at research. One is sort of based on the phenomenon. there's a phenomenon that you encountered maybe in your business career or maybe just reading literature, and you want a sort of an explanation for what you're seeing. And then you're reaching around what kind of theories would be most applicable. The other way to come at it is that I have this theory that I think is pretty compelling. What can it shed light on? I've got the hammer. Is there some kind of nail that I can hammer in? And I think either way can work. Either way can fail miserably. Mm-hmm. And I think thinking about, first of all, at least acknowledging which path you're going for is important. In my case, I was wanting to go for, because I didn't have a lot of business experience, I felt like I needed to do something more inductive to start my dissertation, to learn a little bit. And that was something very much encouraged by my advisor. So it was the idea of, can I go inside some firms and see whether the mechanisms around that they're discussed in the M-Form literature are they really being implemented? Do they really exist? And are there some things that seem to be important in the companies I'm talking to, but yet not reflected in the treatments?
Okay.
I did not have, in my first part of this, a very well specified research question. I think it's better to have that, better to have that and not. But it was, again, my little bit unique situation that I wanted to do something a little more inductive. And in some sense, what the inductive thing is doing research to come up with an interesting question, mm-hmm. or one step beyond that, a hypothesis that can be tested elsewhere. It's less done nowadays. And then my other two papers were really more top down. Okay, I have a question that was actually informed by my inductive work that I then could test on some large sample data. So that's another way to do research. It's harder, takes a long time.
Yeah.
Which is, you first come up with a question by doing inductive work, and then you try to develop a hypothesis from that, then you go test it on large sample work. That's hard to do. I don't necessarily recommend it, but that's how I ended up. It took me longer to do my dissertation.
Interviews. What surprised you, or what didn't you expect that you found in those interviews?
Well, what I found, what I wrote about in the first chapter of my dissertation, was that there seemed to be a lot more variation within the what would have been called M-Form organizations, mm-hmm. than had been acknowledged by Chandler and Williamson and others. They liked to treat it as a single category, and that was a big emphasis. But at least what I wrote about is the idea that there can be variation within that is non-trivial and that really affects strategic decisions.
Good. Okay. So in terms of, completing the project, beyond just, finding the topic, finding the question, what were the biggest challenges that you had to overcome in doing your dissertation, whether it be data collection, data analysis, writing, framing, whatever?
So two of my dissertation chapters did involve a lot of interviews, mm-hmm. which I'd never done before. And it meant kind of working like a journalist. You talk to one person, you get leads about other people to talk to, you try to triangulate, you use your contacts, you use your even personal network. And I'd never really done that before, so that in some sense that was a challenge. In another sense, it was not that difficult because people wanted to talk to me, I think, because I was not a threat. Just a lonely doctoral student. Nothing I would write, anybody would read or care about.
Right.
And people to talk about their work.
Somebody to listen to. They'd
like to talk about their work. And I would say, secondly, I mostly talk to engineers. some managers, but mostly engineers. And engineers tend to be more candid, I find. They're more devoted to getting it right than trying to cover their you-know-what, be political like a lot of managers. And I could ask them a lot. I could ask them, I was not interested in their perceptions. I was much more interested in the facts, like what's going on. So it was it was an initial challenge, but then it ended up not being too difficult. Yeah.
Okay. So I noticed, one of your earliest collaborations with Julia Liebeskind. Can you tell us a little bit about how that collaboration came about and how that worked?
Well, Julia and I were assistant professors together at USC. She had an office right across from me. She studied with Dick Rommel at UCLA and also Bill Ochi. So she came from a similar kind of economics or organizational economics tradition and strategy. Very, very smart lady. Unfortunately, her husband died of a very, very vicious form of cancer within just a few months of being diagnosed. And it was a tremendous blow to her and led her to kind of reevaluate her career, and she ended up leaving the field of strategy. She was older anyway when she got her PhD, already in her mid-30s, so she was a real loss to our field.
Yeah.
But we both, I think it was both, a lot of conversations, I guess is how I would say it, and we shared the same perspective that, wow, transaction cost economics could really help to inform strategy. And yet it's a very narrow kind of lens. We certainly need to broaden it out in order for it to be useful. How can we do that? And our first thought was, well, we know that path dependence is very important in strategy. Initial decisions have very long run implications. That's not really reflected very well in TCE. How do we sort of incorporate that? And I should say that Williamson, by the way, Oliver Williamson just died last week, unfortunately. He was not that interested, frankly, in his students or anyone else trying to combine TCE with something else. He wasn't that interested. And he saw it as a lens that you put on to view the world, view it in contractual terms. And by trying to introduce these other considerations, learning or path dependence or behavioral things, for him, it just muddied the waters. But Julie and I shared that interest. She was also a more mature person than me. She had a lot of business experience. She was already well along an assistant professor. So it turned out to be a very productive, I would say just very enjoyable co-authorship. But unfortunately, I was always hoped it would last our whole careers, but her career ended up being short.
Yeah, I only met her once at an academy conference, and I was definitely very impressed. So, yeah. So how did you tell us a little bit about the progression of the projects that you've done since then? How did you get from those early projects that may be based on your dissertation or your collaborations with Julia to what you've been doing more recently?
I mean, like I said, I think that my overarching theme has been, how do we take organizational economics, add in some considerations that people in strategy have talked about for a long time,
right?
Like learning or path dependence or
capability
development. And by joining the two, try to explain something that can't be explained by either alone.
Right.
It's like sort of adding another variable, actually adding an interaction term in a regression, sort of.
Right.
Trying to better explain vertical integration decisions, or better explain provisions you see in a contract, or better explain why companies, when they'll be centralized or decentralized. So the phenomena are similar in that we're asking about sort of organizational and arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we see the arrangements that we do? Which ones seem to produce better performance than others? And then we try to use TCE combined with some other theory. Maybe it's maybe evolutionary economics, to try to improve the explanatory power of our models. That would be my theme. And I think that's continuing now with Luis. We're trying to look at formal and informal organization, where informal is measured by networks, and the formal organization, yeah, it's informed by TCE, has something to say about that. It's not the only theory that says something about formal organization, but it says something interesting. So that combination. Today, I'm going to talk about relational contracts, which is, I view it as a branch of organizational economics that was formed and inspired by TCE. TCE, yeah.
Yep. So your answer kind of leads me to my next question. So your, excuse me, your research, as you said, your theme has been to focus on the intersection between organizational economics and, excuse me, strategy-driven phenomena, right? So whether that be capability development or technology or whatever. So with that kind of in mind as the definition of your topic, what do you think are the most important unanswered questions at this point on that topic area of, you know, the intersection of organizational economics and strategy phenomena? What do you think do we not know at this point that we ought to know?
Well, I think one whole area that is ripe for research. The one is essentially a combination of organizational economics or institutions and behavioral considerations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually something that's beginning to be researched already. How do different formal organizational arrangements affect people's behaviors, and vice versa? How might behaviors shape organizational arrangements for better or worse? And I think in some sense that's there's been so much very successful work done in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics, but often institution free. So they're done in a lab. It's not clear what the organizational rules are. They're not really well defined in the lab. Those lab studies are important, right? Because they do a very good identification of an effect. But the question is, does that effect also apply in organizations? And how might it apply differently under different organizational arrangements? I think that's a very great area for study and very still understudied, but beginning to be studied.
Yeah, I agree. You know, the integration of behavioral aspects into strategy research is, I think, you know, obviously there's been a bunch of it done, but I think there's a lot more that can be done. You know, I've had this off and on conversation with Libby Weber for about the last 5 years, for example, about how to integrate, you know, heuristics and biases into our understanding of where companies find bargains in the strategic factor markets, right? How does that influence, for example, M&A markets, that sort of thing? I think there's a lot that could be done on that.
Yeah. And I think another area I would point to is the idea that, you know, competitive advantage for a firm, if it has an organizational root, it may just not have it may not be about organization. It may be about you got the factor before anybody else did, but if it's about organization, probably informal organization, or at least the intersection of formal and informal are probably more important than just formal. And I think there's a lot of room to study those interactions. And it's not just me that says that. It's actually a very nice paper by Bill McKevely and his co-authors in the Academy of Management Annals, which is just about how little we know about informal organization and how formal and informal combine, with the idea that some companies may be able to subtly impact their informal organization to get a lot more productivity from their employees. And to some extent, my paper with Luis is about that. We're not getting to competitive advantage really. Maybe in our second paper, we start to get that a little bit. But I think in general, and also secondly, since we have this model, these ability to measure informal organization now a little bit better through networks. It's not a perfect measure by any means, but that's been a barrier to studying the phenomenon. You don't see it. But if you can use networks to see it and model it and understand different structures and how they're impacted by different choices of formal organization, I think you're starting to get at how companies might build advantage that way. I think that's a ripe area for research.
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. So let me ask you a little bit of a different question that's more related to the research process. You know, about 15 years ago, I was consulting with a career coach. And because honestly, I wasn't sure that this was the right career for me. So I was, considering alternatives, and I was complaining about a bunch of projects that I was working on that were very frustrating and that were failing and, weren't having the kind of success that I had hoped for. And she asked me a simple question. She asked me, do I have a set of criteria for deciding what projects to commit to, what projects to do? And I had to admit at the time that I did not have a set of criteria for that. And so, I'll just ask you, what are the criteria that you might apply, either consciously or unconsciously, about how you choose projects and what, which ones you decide you're really going to commit to versus which ones maybe you'll dabble in for a little bit and to try out. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, one nice thing about being steeped in a particular intellectual tradition is that the questions come pretty naturally out of that tradition. I don't want to say everybody should be steeped in a tradition. It can be constraining as well. And you can be putting blinders on. And that's a little bit what I was fighting against with Williamson a little bit. He wanted to really narrow the focus to the point where you get some questions that are not interesting anymore. Right? They become very incremental. So, but I think that's why I feel like I have not had trouble coming up with questions, is that the tradition I come from is so rich, it just generates a lot of questions, and you're able to distinguish what's important from what's not important. So for me, the phenomenon has to be an important one. And I would say, I want to put some meat on that. You can think of a lot of business phenomena now that are happening now that get a lot of press.
Right.
But how much of the economy do they really represent? Mm-hmm. Are they really that important in the large scheme of things? Or are they just sort of a curiosity because they're new? I tend to go for kind of phenomena that I think are like questions that will be with us forever, like the boundaries of the firm or how organizations interact with each other or contracting, almost regardless of what business environment you're in, what geographically or over time, those questions will be there. I tend to stay away from the latest, hottest thing that may seem like it's important now, but over the long run may not be.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little cost to that, which is that sometimes studying the latest, hottest thing gets you a lot of attention.
It does.
But that, I worry that the attention can be very short-lived. Because then you have to move on to the next thing, and you may not have a basis to do that.
Right. Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, we do have some doctoral students who come at the project from a more phenomenon-based perspective, who are, you know, interested, for example, in platforms or blockchain or crowdfunding or whatever it is. And so you're looking for a phenomenon that you would call important, I think you said. So how do you recognize an important phenomenon when you see it? How do you distinguish it from a less important phenomenon?
Well, I think that's where our theories matter.
Okay.
That's where our theories matter. If our theories say that, look, what is inside and what is outside the firm is like a really fundamental question, then anything related to that is going to be interesting. Now that, or if our theories say that social networks have a huge impact on people's behavior and choices, then that is a theory that, you know, should guide what is interesting and what is not. So to me, I think studying those modern phenomenon Fabrice has a very nice new paper. Fabrice is there about blockchain. So I think that actually is a phenomenon that is potentially interesting, but to be able to connect, to show how our theories can help explain that phenomenon, or how they might need to be modified to do it, that I think is where the contribution comes in and what makes it important.
Yep, that makes sense. So what what would you say are what lessons have you learned so far in your career? Are there any, you know, is this career, you know, exactly the way you expected it to be from the start, or are there things that surprised you and lessons learned and that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. One lesson I have learned that I talk about sometimes is that strategy is a great field. And thank God I went into it, because when I talk to people from other fields, their lives are harder. When I talk to people from econ or psychology, political science, certainly the natural sciences is a slog. Very competitive, you know, fighting for grant money if you're in natural sciences. Economics, you could see, takes years to publish anything. People are very persnickety. Whereas strategy, virtually, I mean, it attracts open-minded people. Anything that, you know, has to do with firm performers or competitive advantage, we're interested in. Doesn't have to be bad economics or psychology or sociology or anything. We're phenomenon driven, and that just provides people a lot more creative freedom, I think. A lot more room. You still have to do work that meets high quality standards. But in terms of, compared to some other fields, we're a little less disciplined. Think about it that way. It's disciplined, a little less disciplined. And that has suited me very well.
It's interesting because, you know, last week when I asked Will Mitchell why he chose strategy over finance, he gave almost the same answers, what you just said. Very, very similar.
Oh, finance, yeah, it's another one. Finance, yeah, think about finance and corporate finance. It's all about agency theory. That's all they want to talk about.
Right.
And not that agency theory is not important. It certainly explains a lot of stuff, but there are a lot of other phenomena that it doesn't speak to. And so finance just doesn't take those other phenomena on, like firm capabilities, you know, to just ignore it.
So if you were starting all over today, like some of our doctoral students you're speaking to, is there anything you would do differently?
I think that I did not have the ideal background for this career. I think an ideal background would have been some more time working in organizations, on getting to know them better. I tried to make up for that with this inductive work in my dissertation, but it's not the same as, real experience. So if I were to do it again, I mean, I'm not sure I would have known enough to be able to do it, but I would have probably wanted to work a couple of years before jumping into a PhD, to get even a better feeling for the phenomena.
Okay, that makes sense.
Coming at everything as like an academic.
And so you've worked with a number of doctoral students at this point, right? What's the most important piece of advice that you give to your own doctoral students?
Yeah, I saw that question, and it's kind of doctoral student dependent, but I guess one common thing is to think about supply and demand. I guess because I'm an economist, I go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
So in choosing your topic, it's got to be a topic that you can supply because you've got the capabilities and the interest. Both of those have to be there. And there's got to be some demand. There's got to be some interest by others in that topic. And often what I see doctoral students do is they're paying a lot of attention to demand, but not that much to supply.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other way, a lot to supply and not so much to demand. And I think for success, you gotta match them.
Yeah.
And it's tricky.
I think
your advisor can guide you.
Good. Well, let me just take a moment and see if anybody else has any questions for you. Anybody want to raise any questions for Nick?
So if I may ask a question, Rich.
Sure, of course.
So one of the challenges I think people seem to observe is that there is a sense of delay in explaining some of the important phenomena that we see in the process unfolding these days. And also to be able to modify some of the theories that could explain further and regenerate some of them so that that's adaptable enough for us to understand it better. You touched upon it a little bit. I would like to hear your thoughts about it further.
Yes. Could you maybe was there a particular example you had in mind?
So for example, I do some work on platform-based business models. Yes. So, if you look at econ, for instance, there's a 15 years of experience now in the field about what are the kind of things which would be making a platform-based business model successful and whatnot. There are economics questions about it. But for instance, something related to your interest, for example, I don't know, I might be wrong, but I don't know what would be a good TCE perspective, for example, on platform-based markets. We have complementers who are loosely connected. They are not really contractually bound, but they still are really needed for this value proposition for in any form to emerge. But they are not really in or out, or they are not even in an alliance type relationships. It's a very complicated, but all of them need to be in place. If I may use some kind of a Ron Natna type language, you need them to be aligned in a way that certain way in a certain format for things to work out. But I haven't heard anything much TCE people responding to that or expanding on it. But 7 out of the 8 largest firms are now platform-based firms, so something probably need to be done, I would imagine.
Yeah, I actually think there is some work by Rahul Kapoor on relationships between platform firms and complementers, and I think it's a think of the platform as a governance structure. there may be some of these complementers may have licensing agreements with the platform provider, or they may have to have their application approved, right? If you're writing for Apple or Sony PlayStation or whatever, they'll have to approve you. So there is a governance structure. There are some that are very loose. Of course, Android, right? Anybody can put anything up there. But part of that, here an interesting question would be, what makes for a more or less successful governance structure of your complementers? Think about a tight versus a loose licensing policy, for example. When should it be tight? When should it be loose? What are the contingencies in the environment based on competition with other platforms, how mature the platform is? Really, if you think about the platform, you're trying to get a lot of cooperation between the complementers and the platform. You want to stimulate some competition amongst the complementers, but not maybe excessive. So this is a whole governance structure. And yes, it's not as formal in many cases. The elements are not always as formal, but yet there are rules that the platform always promulgates. So I do think that there's potential there for that. And actually, the paper I'm going to talk about refers to another paper that's came out this year on relational contracts that we think applies not only to buyers and sellers, but also applies to platform owners and complementers. I think of a relational contract where we don't have a lot written down, but there's an understanding that if you cooperate with me, if you continue to make, let's say, great games for my console, I'll continue to give the APIs to you or continue to license to you. If you mess up, I might punish you. If I take advantage of you, you might punish me. So you can start to think of a game theoretic treatment of a relational contract. And then the question is, how do we structure that relational contract such that both parties cooperate with each other over the long term? Can we use punishments? Can we use bonuses? And then do we observe anything like that in being implemented by any of those companies? So I don't know if TCE strictly, I would say more organizational economics more generally, I think can speak to the organization of a platform kind of economy.
I'm glad Anpu asked that question because he and I are working on a paper where we're trying to flesh out the idea of a platform as a governance structure that allows a company, in effect, to outsource its diversification decisions, basically. Mm-hmm. Right? It's saying, we don't know exactly what the market wants. So, what features customers are going to want in our product. So we're just going to outsource those decisions to complementors, outsource the diversification decisions to the world, in effect.
So, right. Because you're dealing with customers with such a heterogeneous set of demands, very hard to manage just internally yourself. Yeah. So we thought outsourcing the diversification had kind of cachet to it.